Welcome to the Nerds and Friends podcast. Today we are joined by author Francesco Levato, talking about his book and all of the other work he's done. Thank you so much for being here today, Francesco. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about the book and
Yeah.
it's a
No,
adventure.
you sent it to me, and I really liked that it was a mix of like poetry and visual art. Like it was just a really cool way of exploring ideas. Like, how did the idea kind of like come to fruition? Like, where did it start in your mind?
So the book in the state it was finally published in kind of evolved over the course of the lockdown during COVID-19. I was um, kind of struggling with a way to respond to the pandemic poetically. I mean, I'm primarily a poet, and so my work is also very often um, some form of like social commentary or examination. And, everything just kind of shut down abruptly. And it was such a weird and jarring experience. For the longest time, I didn't quite know how to respond to it. So I started um, reading through older narratives on pandemics, and I came across the Scarlet Plague by
Oh,
Jack London, on archive.org. I do a lot of work with archive.org,
oh,
like
very
public
cool.
domain material. And in the book, I started to um, find language that kind of resonated with me in relationship to my current situation. And so I began the process of doing what's called an erasure. So an erasure poem, for anybody that's not familiar with it, is essentially starting with an existing text. It could be any text, really. It doesn't have to be narrative. It could be other poetry. It could be textbooks. And I've done it with all kinds of work, including like government documents.
Oh, that's
Um,
cool.
but the idea is to look through the text and find language that depending on your technique. For me, it's language that resonates with me. It always tends to be something that starts off as more intuitive. So I don't specifically search for language to meet a specific type of poem. It just
Okay.
whatever is happening in my life at the time sends to kind of surface this language that I find. So once you find the language that really resonates with you, you find some way to isolate it, and then another way to get rid of the text surrounding it. So what ends up happening is you kind of surface these words that form the final poem.
Okay.
Um, and authors do this in a number of different ways, from simply using like a Sharpie, essentially, right, to just kind of black out the text like a redacted document, right, and just
Yeah.
leave only the text that you're supposed to like read as the poem.
Okay.
Others have used a reverse technique where they will just white everything out, and so you have the text kind of floating on the page.
Okay.
And then others take it to really artistic levels, visually, at any rate, like Tom Phillips in this book called The Humament, where he went through and not only erased um, all this text to form poems from this Victorian novel. He then did these really elaborate illustrations and collages in
Oh,
combination with it, right?
that's
So you get
cool.
this really like visually stunning piece. So the erasure was the start of this project, but it still wasn't adequately responding to just this bizarre fractured world we were in when everything shut down. I mean, obviously we all remember. It's like, I was afraid to like get deliveries. It's like we were washing everything with alcohol,
Yeah.
or whatever we can get our hands on at the time before it even came into the house. And so like the home, formerly this like safe space, became this weird kind of threat almost, right?
Yeah.
And
Or like a
so
little bubble of safety that was constantly under attack. It was very strange. Yeah.
yeah, it was. And it rendered things that normally would be part of that comfort, it just rendered them really kind of strange, and
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out a way to respond to it. So I started with this erasure of this text, the Scarlet Plague. but I am also a digital media artist, and I'm always trying to push the ways my text and visual work can kind of interact and mingle. And so I was starting to um, think about how to bring images of everyday life into this erasure, and while doing that, make some kind of comment on this bizarre kind of fractured existence that we were living in, right? These safe spaces that were also threatening and also isolating.
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of defamiliarize everyday objects around the house, um, to kind of make a comment on that like feeling. And so I started working with glitched imagery. It's a technique that I've used in the past, but at the time, I would actually go in and mess up the digital files myself. So uh,
Oh,
I'll talk a bit about terms like and how we use these. So like when we talk about glitched imagery, it is a technique where you intentionally introduce errors into a digital file and then see what the results are.
that's
Um,
fascinating. Wow.
yeah, so like you could open up a JPEG file in a text editor, and you could just it's going to be a bunch of code, right? And you could randomly like delete lines, add text, and then resave that text file and open it back up in a app that will look at a JPEG, and you'll see all the distortions that you messing with that code did.
I never thought
Um,
that that was a thing, but that totally makes sense.
Yeah, and so so I went back to I'd done some experiments with that in the past. I'm like, that might be an interesting way to like take still lives of like everyday stuff around the house and kind of fracture it in a way that might represent this kind of state of self during the
Yeah.
pandemic.
Wow.
And so I started glitching imagery of just, well, you'll see the titles in the book. Like the titles in the book essentially are the items in the still life. It's like here's
Yeah.
something on the counter. Here's, some things on the bookshelf. Here's, my desk as I'm trying to prepare a new course for my grad students while everybody is in lockdown, and so I
Yeah.
named them after the actual still lives, but because I'm intentionally introducing errors into the code, they're fractured and they're hard to make out what they are. Some are easier to make out than others, but most of them are just, I've really um, kind of glitched them. And then I would
That's so
combine that
cool.
with the text.
That's
Sorry,
a
I'm kind of babbling on
No,
about
this is
this.
really informative. I'm learning a ton. And Will, thank you. I'm glad your camera's working now. I know for a minute there you were
Yeah.
just a floating name for a little bit, but speaking of
Yeah.
glitched imagery, no.
Yes. Case in point, me, myself, and I.
Well, Will,
Hello.
I'm so glad you joined
Hello.
because Francesco, my co-host Will, is also a digital artist. So I'm really
Oh,
excited you guys are
awesome.
talking about this because, yeah, I love in your book Scarlet just the way that I was vaguely familiar with the idea of erasure poetry, and when you explained it, I
Okay.
knew what it was. But in yours, it wasn't just like you said, redacting documents or whiting out. There was a lot more going on around it that really informed my tone as a reader, just looking at the poem, and it kind of set the tone visually as I started digesting the words and their meanings. So that was just really cool how that all came together, you know?
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I want when I do erasures, I typically try to allow some access to the surrounding text. I just find it provides a really interesting context,
Yeah.
and maybe not even context. It might provide like, you know, an interesting contrast. It really depends on the
Yeah.
documents I'm working with. In my previous book, Arsenal sin Documentos, it was an examination of um, our legally encoded violence against immigrant bodies. And so I worked exclusively with government documents. And so I was searching through that document for text that kind of revealed this violence that was encoded in law.
Hmm.
And so for me, it was very important to make sure that that text was the most present as opposed to some of the surrounding language, because it's really buried like in this very kind of technocratic
Mhm.
language that you just might not notice. some of the like shocking violence that's encoded into law. And so for that project, it
Because
was
they want to
important to get
dilute it so people don't pick up on it. So I think work like that is extremely
exactly
important to
Mhm.
say, hey, all this other legalese floating around,
right.
lethal force, those are all kind of just, this is the thing you need to worry about.
Mhm.
So
Right.
that's really cool.
Yeah, but with
And
Scarlet, I wanted to kind of like have that language kind of surrounding the text that I found.
Yeah.
and I think that's kind of really important that you're both uh literally and metaphorically kind of bringing light to this to the things that we don't notice by like highlighting how much information is just hidden there by removing the hidden information, and you can kind of see where it belongs in a way.
Yeah, I like to, oftentimes I'm talking about my process. I like to use the term kind of excavate when I find this
Uh,
language.
Mhm.
And I think it harkens back to me as a child wanting to be an archaeologist. And I blame that on Indiana Jones and my interest in fossils when I was a kid. So,
those are very valid reasons to blame that on because it's pretty alluring stuff.
yeah,
Ancient runes, adventure, fossils.
right.
Yeah, it's very glamorous until you find out what they actually do.
Yeah, when you find out just how problematic it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting because like when you're bringing like you're not just kind of uh excavating, and I think that's like even a better metaphor because if you're thinking of like fossils, these are literally just rocks that are in different shapes, and just being able to like look and try to look and distinguish what is fossilized bone versus what is just like granite. Like I think that's an absolutely beautiful metaphor for like the amount of like important information that just absolutely gets hidden, not just by government documents but like your terms of service for
Mm,
programs or
right.
uh like within the news cycle, even like how much information just kind of gets buried below just, oh, this celebrity tweeted the wrong font of when they were putting out happy
Don't you mean
Halloween.
X'd now? No, I'm just kidding. We don't need to go
No,
down
I
that
do.
rabbit hole. Me and Francesco met on an alternative to the site formerly known as Twitter because we didn't want to support
Yes,
the awful person who bought that site. So happy to.
exactly.
You are the first person I've met on that app to join for the podcast because before I really liked the site formerly known as Twitter for meeting fellow creatives and bringing them on the podcast. And so I was sad to see that go, but I'm glad that we have a better alternative now. So this is really cool.
Yeah, I am too. That's like the primary reason that I moved to Blue Sky. Oh, sorry, should I not say
Oh,
the?
you could say it. I
Oh, you
was,
can
Okay.
yeah,
say it.
yeah.
So like, when everything first came down with just Twitter collapsing, I moved to Mastodon, which has a great writing community. Like,
Really, I think
um,
I got on
you
there.
know,
Just the UI wasn't excellent. It was hard to navigate the app
Mhm.
itself.
it definitely takes a lot of work to get up to speed on it, and that really, that turned away a lot of like my community. Like most of the publishers that I work with are all went to Blue Sky, and I resisted for a while because I really wanted to, rebuild the community on Mastodon. But at some point, I'm like, I need to connect with the publishers that I work with, and they're on Blue Sky. And so I started that up, and that's, like you said, that's where we met, which I thought was awesome. So far, I really like how the community is kind of working there and building. It's like
Yeah,
I actually get responses to my posts, and I
yeah.
actually meet other writers, which is awesome. Whereas, on the site formerly known as Twitter, I mean, that kind of engagement, I mean, over the years has just plummeted. I used to use it as a collaborative writing platform. Like I would
Oh,
do, um, so, I mean, can I go in that direction? We just kind of talk about all kinds
absolutely.
of
Yeah.
creative stuff.
We have no restrictions
So,
here. Yeah, let's talk about
all
it.
right, awesome. Have you heard of the surrealist parlor game called Exquisite Corpse?
No.
Yes.
Will's
Yeah.
heard of
Okay.
it.
Well,
So
I haven't heard
so
of it.
so you know that, at least Will, you know that, and if you're doing the image based version, you pretty much, you have a piece of paper. Each participant draws a
mhm,
little bit of an illustration, folds it, hands it to the next
mhm,
person so they can't
mhm,
see. They do another part, fold it again, and you keep on doing that.
mhm.
And then you unfold it, and it's this bizarre kind of creation, right? Because
Yes.
everybody's contributed a part without being able to see the previous part.
That's cool.
Mhm,
Um, so a surrealist writing technique is very similar based on the exquisite corpse, where you write a line to a poem, fold it over, hide it, pass it to the next person, and they continue the process. And so when you unfold it,
mhm,
you have a poem created by all these lines that don't necessarily go together. Um, so I wanted to try and find a way to use Twitter as a writing platform. And so maybe 2016, 2015, something like that. I
mhm.
started a collaborative, like, exquisite corpse on Twitter. And I used the hashtag at the time. It was PXC001. I don't know if you can still find it. I archived it right before I left because I wanted to make sure I had at least a PDF of like all the tweets. But I
Yeah.
mean, we pulled in writers from like all over the country. Some international. Vice Motherboard did a story on it at the time,
Nice.
and like I had teachers like having their students participate in it. So like we
Oh,
get
that's
students that would
cool.
and so it was just this huge like community that like came together, and we would each write like one line of this exquisite corpse and just keep building on everybody else's work. And it just kept going and going and going. So it was like, I don't know, probably over 20 pages long.
Mhm,
Um,
Whoa.
when I finally archived it, just like 20 like pages worth of tweets essentially, right?
mhm.
Yeah.
But and I miss having the ability to collaborate with writers like that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
so
Because
so
when you're
blue
able to
sky
like
so
kind of
far.
cast the net out over such a wide range of users, you're going to get some real gems contributed back, which is really cool. Like
Mhm.
I feel like social media definitely has pros and cons, but one of the pros is just the reach and the accessibility. I think is a really
Right.
cool thing about it, you know?
Yeah, and that's got to be really fascinating when you're looking at that. I know from having done this with friends, and like I've did this a little bit in school, and when when you're doing that exquisite corpse, sometimes you end up with just this bizarre, like, the collective consciousness has kind of created this coagulation into something that's coherent and interesting, and other times it's
Right.
just so far detached from anything that anyone would have contributed that you're just left with something that uh is entirely novel, which is
Right.
almost impossible to engage in yourself, to think of something that you've never thought before.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've had I've had very similar results when I run this exercise with my students, and sometimes they are eerily in sync
Mhm,
without having like read the previous lines. Like themes tend to emerge and like at
Oh,
least an overall feeling, and other
mhm,
times it's just completely surreal, right? It's just
wow.
mhm,
it's a mishmash of like lines that just do not go together. But sometimes there's this really cool kind of like
mhm.
synergy that happens with a process like that.
Oh, yeah.
um
And
yeah,
I
I started. Oh, sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I was gonna say, and that's kinda like the beauty that, we were kinda sold on with social media,
Mm,
was this, like, town square collective consciousness, where everyone's contributing something to, and you're kinda elevating, like,
Social discourse.
yes.
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I'm
But
trying to. So I do this on Mastodon. I started it recently on Blue Sky.
Mhm,
Again, with this mind towards connecting with the writing community and like participating in it in a way that is not just, hey, here's my latest this. It's like actually like
mhm,
being an engaged member. And so over the summer I was doing I was participating in, and then I helped out towards the end with a series of writing prompts that another writer was doing. Mastodon in the writing groups has just a ton of really awesome writing prompts that people put out weekly, from
Mhm.
visual prompts to just textual.
That's cool.
And so I started working with another writer who was putting these 50-word prompts. So
Mhm.
you need to write, if you're familiar with like microfiction.
Mhm.
So in the world of microfiction or flash fiction, we go, this is at the level below short stories. So a flash fiction piece is typically 500 to 1,000 words.
Okay.
And so it's a complete story in that space. And then you can get even more restrictive and work with a form called a drabble. These names are very odd, but the drabble is a 100-word story, very
Oh,
strict, right? Tell an entire story in 100 word. A dribble is a 50-word story. And so
wow.
this writer was doing these 50-word stories based on her prompts. And I actually got some, in doing the 50-word stories, I actually expanded some of those into longer flash pieces because I really
Oh,
liked what
cool.
came out of them. And so I started trying to do something similar on Blue Sky. But what I did was I started posting visual writing prompts, and especially
Mhm.
because we're now in like my favorite month, being Halloween,
Yeah.
or being October and
Absolutely.
Halloween and spooky season. I started posting all these like really just kind of bizarre and unsettling AI created images as writing prompts, like from creepy Victorian children surrounded by broken dolls to these like little poppets that look like they were carved from bone. I mean,
Mhm.
I'm fascinated with AI. Not, I mean, because as a digital media artist and someone
Mhm.
who is always experimenting, I like to see what the tools can do. And what I find fascinating and unsettling about AI art is how often it makes these very weird choices in like human anatomy. And
Yes,
so
I've seen that.
and yeah, and so I'm posting these images for the writing prompts, and they might seem like a normal scene, but there are certain parts of the body that are just really wrong, and there's
Yeah.
this bizarre creepiness to it. I'm like, I think these would make good writing prompts for the
Yeah.
month of October.
It's always
So
that's been my personal joy, is just looking at AI art and realizing that computers seem to have figured out that humans have between 3 and 12 fingers on each hand.
exactly, exactly, or that their elbows bend the opposite direction,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
or sometimes have between 3 and 5 legs.
right, yeah,
So
totally. And
strange.
it's not even like, it's not even so much the uncanny valley effect, which is like where there
Mhm.
is a computer simulation of a human figure that is so close but just slightly off,
Mhm.
right? No, it's not that at all. It's just bizarre.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, where
and
it's
I find it
almost
so unsettling.
it's
It's
not even
wrong in a way where you're like, why would you think of this? And
yeah.
that's more wrong than the wrongness of the image almost,
Yeah,
Yeah,
where
exactly.
it's not even surreal, it's just alien.
Yeah, totally, totally.
Yeah. And
Well,
that's
Francesco, you've
mhm.
motivated me to get back on Mastodon and keep figuring out how to use it, because as a writer, I find that being in a writing community, like if you're engaging, that's awesome. But like even just hearing other writers talk about, hey, I had this experience and here's kind of how I dealt with it. Sometimes it'll be like, oh, I didn't expect that, and I can kind of take that wisdom and apply it to whatever I'm struggling with as a writer. So it's hugely invaluable. So that's really good to hear that Mastodon's active and that I should work to get in there. That's a really good thing to know as a writer. So
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll send you a link to the instance that is very, very writerly focused and has
awesome.
like a lot of
Mhm.
great prompts.
Thank you. I'd appreciate that.
They also do like, they just do cool things, like they do something called Monster Dawn, which is on Sundays, and they started watching like rewatching collectively as a group and commenting on like old Godzilla movies and stuff like that, which
Nice.
Oh,
was like awesome. I
yes.
know they moved on to like other monsters and kaiju, which is really cool.
That's awesome.
So yeah, it's really lively.
Mhm.
You got to get past that like initial learning curve.
Yeah, because at
Um,
first they were like having me select a server, and I'm like, this is hard, so
yeah,
Yeah. I've had the same issue of trying to figure out Mastodon. I really would love to join you guys on Blue Sky, but Blue Sky won't let me.
Why not?
I keep trying to
I
register and they keep saying, "Okay, you're on a wait list."
Really?
I have a invitation code I can send you. So
It's
email me after we get done and I will send it to you. Yeah, and you guys should check out the visual writing prompts too if you're in a writerly mood uh for the Halloween season. I've got it limited to um ain't no specific form except that it needs to fit within the 300 character limit of a post on Blue Sky, which is ridiculously short, but it's
Mhm.
interesting to see what you can do story wise within that space.
yeah.
um,
Mhm.
I mean, for me, as primarily I mean, I'm a poet, but I'm also a speculative fiction writer. Most of my books to date have been that are published are in poetry, and I find that being a poet, writing in this really restricted word count, um, you know, is much more natural for me. Like, because I'm so used to distilling language down to like the most important images, right? And like the choice of not only the choice of like an adjective, but the choice of like a verb can say so much in such
Mhm.
a short space. And that's what these little microfiction forms like kind of require too.
Yeah. And that's one thing that I've always found. I'm a visual artist, but I imagine it's got to be pretty similar for prose, is that when you end up with more restrictions, you end up getting being able to flex more of those creative muscles to
Mhm.
try to produce something within those restrictions, whereas
Mhm.
when you don't have any limits on what you can do, it's kind of it's almost difficult to really do your best work with when you're just completely unrestrained.
Yep.
Right. I mean, I actually find like as a writer, I find um, working with constraints to open up a lot of possibilities I hadn't thought about before.
Yep.
I started working heavily with constraints after let me go back to about 2010. I was working on a long documentary poem um, called War Rug, and it was based on the wars in um, Iraq and Afghanistan.
Really
And
quickly, I am curious. What is a documentary poem? I haven't heard of this term.
so a documentary poem very much shares the same impulse of a documentary film, and that is you are trying to document the real experience of your subject using actual source material. Like in the same way in a documentary film, you might bring in news clips,
Right.
you might bring in interviews, you might bring in archival footage. So documentary poetics has a similar aesthetic, right? You work with pre-existing documents. You can mix visual in with it as well. I was building that long form poem from again, government documents, news reports. I mixed in some of my own. It was also a hybrid piece, so I mixed in some of my own creative writing. And I would do some ekphrastic pieces based on imagery, like there was this really disturbing toy that came out at the time from JC, and it was sold in the JC Penney catalog of like a it was like a war toy that had like soldiers in this burnt out um, building that was so the toy came with this burnt out building that was like destroyed and bombed, and it actually had like blood stains on the wall, and it was very clearly a building that looked like it was from the region, right, with
Wow.
American soldiers in it. And so like I wrote a little ekphrastic piece
Huh.
based on that particular image in the catalog.
You're like,
So
that's disturbing even for propaganda. That's ugh.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that it was like it was in the JC Penney like Christmas catalog that year. It's just
Ugh.
bizarre.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. So that was a
Yeah.
really heavy project. And when I finished writing that book, I at first I struggled with moving into a different mode, like not focusing still on
Mhm.
the work that I'd done in the previous project. But also it was such a heavy topic that I needed to kind of give myself some space to be able to, um, you know, write creatively again. And so I started working with constraints, and
Mm.
they are, and visual artists do this too, right? They will also work with different types of constraints, but from a writer's
Hmm.
perspective, I turn to things like there is there's a lot of different like experimental like poetry techniques that use writing constraints from um, you know like only writing with and eliminating one particular word from the vocabulary to a technique from the Ulipo writers where you take there's different variations of it, but like N+1 is one where you replace every noun in your piece with um, the noun in the dictionary plus one. So you find your noun in the dictionary, and then you take the next noun that comes right after it, replace all of your nouns like that. And there's techniques like called N+7 and things like that that do a
Hmm.
similar thing. Um, I started using techniques like that. I started working with a lot of found language, which is I was just combing through um, all kinds of texts on archive.org, from like old like science and physics manuals to old books on spiritualism. And like I would just read through them, and any kind of language that surfaced that was really kind of resonant with me, I would collect and put aside in like a Word document, and then I'd eventually assemble poems from this. And so like restricting myself to only working with pre-existing texts um, or various types of writing constraints, to focus my writing on looking for language out there, and that didn't come necessarily from within, really helped me move on from that really heavy book. So,
Hmm.
That's fascinating. I think that will actually help me in my writing too, because like I write a lot of like indie novels, so those are just kind of whatever
mm,
I want them to be. But I've found that
mm,
things that have really helped me, like I helped a friend out with writing some screenplays for a children's show, which is not any. I've never like written anything
Hmm.
for young audiences or anything like that, and so having to make my wording very precise and focused and simplistic,
right.
it was a really good writing exercise. So I
Hmm.
think doing more exercises with any kind of constraint will help. And I've seen exactly what you're talking about, Francesco, in the film industry as well. Like when a director and a writer get like a massive, blockbuster budget, they tend to make stuff that's just more audience mass appeal.
Hmm.
Mm,
It's not as nuanced. And then when you have movies where they're trying to do something, but they have a lot of budget cutbacks, like on the days where with the budget constraints and then just whatever's going wrong on set that day, they have to work around it
right.
creatively. That's when you get the magic and
Hmm.
the scenes that really resonate with people, I've found mostly. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to live through that process. My
Right.
wife is a screenwriter and a
Hmm.
filmmaker, and
Yeah.
so I know what happens when she's like on set and she's trying to make her day, and that they have to like start cutting scenes to
Yeah.
be able to make the
Hmm.
day, and it's like too nerve-wracking for me, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's why I
I think.
definitely have preferred writing to being on set lately. It's a lot better
Hmm.
for my
Yeah,
just my mental
Oh
health.
yeah,
I
and
can
I
imagine.
and I think like exercises like that, like anytime that you're just not able to get into the right mindset, like if you're dealing with any type of like art block too, like just exercises or giving yourself a challenge like that, I think it's just
Mhm.
really good to kind of it not just sharpens your skills, but it also kind of forces you out of that comfort zone so that you can kind of get over those
Right.
hurdles.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really does. I find also that like using these types of constraints in writing exercise with my students really helps them too, because oftentimes, like when my undergraduates come in, like this is typical at the lower level undergraduate courses, especially when it comes to writing poetry, they feel that it needs to be all written from the perspective of I, and it needs to emote, and it needs to be all about your personal experiences and your suffering. And eventually that you exhaust that as a writer, right?
Mhm.
And I actually had students like, over the years come to me and be like, I'm tired of writing about myself this way, but I can't get out of it. And so I would introduce them to these constraints that would pull them so far outside of the self that they would discover all this new kind of cool stuff. And I've
Hmm.
expanded this with students to all different types of things that you wouldn't expect to use in a creative writing classroom, right? So
Hmm.
um, last semester, I bought a bunch of indie role playing games, like like one card games, one
Hmm.
page games, right?
Yeah.
These generative journaling type of games from like itch.io. And I like had the students use those to generate new stories. And I had one student just absolutely run with it and ended up with like a novella length manuscript by the end of the course based on
Wow.
the initial like work she had done with that with the
Hmm.
game that she chose, which was essentially like telling the story of a spell book. And I can't remember the particulars, but I mean, it started out as a journaling type, like indie RPG game. Yeah,
Hmm.
and it
That's
was just
cool.
awesome. And I'll adapt other things too. Like for Halloween now, I started this a couple of years ago. For Halloween, what I do with the students is, aside from bringing them Halloween candy and everybody dresses up, I give them a
Hmm.
creative writing assignment that is based on bibliomancy. So like if you're
Hmm.
not familiar with that divination technique, it's a technique where you take a book that's really important to you and you ask a question that you want answered and you flip it open with your eyes closed and randomly point to some part of the page and you look at the sentence that your finger is on, and
Hmm.
that is supposed to give you some insight into your question. And so I've adapted it as a creative writing exercise, like, and a writing constraint where they are creating poems based on found language that they do through this bibliomancy technique with books that are important to them. And so we kind of have like the
Hmm.
spooky themed kind of divination exercise that we do on Halloween,
That's
um,
awesome.
Yeah,
which is producing
that's
pretty
really
cool
cool.
results.
And I think like that kind of ties back to what you're doing with AI as well, where you're using just various tools to try to like give yourself like that bit of noise to start with to
Mhm.
kind of mold into an idea. And I think like that's kind of really important when we are getting into the world where AI is just a constant thing because it's not going anywhere.
Mhm.
Right.
But it's a matter of just figuring out how to use these tools instead of uh just trying to either use that to as the project itself or trying to uh change what it's capable of or what it's good at is just to take it as what it is, which is just kind of generating stuff from the internet and from a whole lot of just collected information and just sorting out this nonsense into something that's coherent and beautiful. And that's really what artists are have always done is just kind of take this take whatever we have in the world and just shape that into something that can be appreciated.
Well said.
Yeah, there's definitely. I fully understand the reservations about AI, and it's very problematic scraping of visual and
Hmm.
textual sources that it doesn't have the right to do to create its models.
Hmm.
Right.
At the same time, I also recognize that it is not going away.
Hmm.
And so, how do we eventually learn to work with it? And I've done exercise with my students. Obviously some professors do not want to have any kind of AI in the classroom. I've actually used it with students. I started with my graduate students in a multicultural lit class last spring, where I wanted them to do a literary analysis of the biases in the language models. And
Hmm.
so what I had them do is I had them generate the same poem or story using Chat GPT, but from different cultural perspectives. and
Oh.
start looking for the types of like problematic language and biases that crept in because it was based on this, this
Mhm.
like far-ranging scraping of text from the internet, right?
Right.
And I don't know if they have since kind of cleaned some of this up, but at the time it was very obviously biased and problematic.
Mhm.
And as far from a creative writing standpoint, it was really simplistic at the time as well. Like the structure of the poems and the
Mhm.
way they're written were very very simplistic. But you could easily see like the bias in the language models, which I thought was fascinating. And so I would use that with them. Um, for projects like that. I actually started working with it, well, twofold. Um, because I create more D&D characters than I will ever possibly be able to use. Part of that process is, and of course, D&D Beyond does not help me with that because it lets me
No.
like,
Makes it too
store
easy.
hundreds of
Dangerous.
them. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and the
And
fact that you have so many slots that you can
mhm,
just keep filling.
yeah,
Not
exactly.
that I would have ever done that.
Like you have no experience with that at all, do
No,
you?
none.
So I started like I used to create back when Hero Forge, even before they started, if you're familiar with
Mm.
the Hero Forge, yeah, the miniature creation.
We are.
Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
I
So, I
imagine pretty
started with
much anybody
them.
watching this channel is going to be the
Yes,
type to be
exactly.
familiar with.
I mean, I started with them, because each time I'd create a new character, I would, obviously I'd create a Hero Forge, a figure for it, and when I was able to play in person. And then when everything got shut down, the pandemic, my group moved online, and I started using it to create at least like my token for
Hmm.
my characters. And then when they came out with the ability to colorize it, I would do that. But then I started playing with AI apps to create the tokens for my characters, right? To create these portraits of my characters,
Yeah.
which I really, which it was just like for personal use. I just really found it fun, and it allowed me to have like a unique image for all of the hundreds of characters that I create. But um, but I had something happen last fall. Um, I got into AI to do work with a new project that I was doing erasures for. But at the time, right before the fall semester started, I got COVID, and the
Oh.
coughing gave me a detached retina.
Oh
And the
no.
detached retina, I had to go in for emergency surgery to kind of
Hmm.
try to restore sight in that eye. And the process that they use took 3 surgeries over the course of 6 months. And for the entire time, my vision was so distorted, like I couldn't drive myself anywhere.
Oh.
I had a really difficult time even reading. And if I ended up wearing an eye patch for most of that
Hmm.
time just to kind of like stop the vision from in that eye from messing with my other eye,
Right.
because it was so distorted. But I started using AI to kind of visually embody that distortion on the page as artwork to combine with the erasures I was working on at that
Hmm.
particular time. And so that's what really got me into working with AI. It's totally like the early pieces, like the background imagery is very bizarre, very disjointed, very surreal. It's hard to make out really much of anything, but it really kind of reflected what I saw when I pulled that eye patch off.
Hmm.
And so that really got me into working with it. And then I just kind of moved on from there to do, all of my character art, and then of course these
Hmm.
visual writing prompts that I've been doing recently.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of part of the beauty of when you're using like AI, and I can't think of any of the names of the visual AI generators, but because it doesn't like think like a human brain, it doesn't process things like a properly working human brain. It's
Right.
you do get a lot of that distortion that you can only get from something being off or wrong. And so
Right.
like I think that's kind of a fascinating way to visualize uh like not being able to see properly, or not having
Mm.
uh that yeah, I lost the words to follow that thought train.
No, I see where you're going though. Yeah, it really was for me, a way to kind of visualize something that, um, or to actually not just to visualize, but to like allow others to
Hmm.
visualize what this distorted vision was like from my perspective, right? Because this
Hmm.
is a, how do you explain, you know, it's not just that like I can't see, it's like I can't see because the vision is so distorted that it like gives me motion sickness. Like how do you represent that visually,
Hmm.
right? And that's what this AI app allowed me to do, was
Yeah.
to start playing around with representing this like visually to somebody who wasn't inside my head essentially.
It almost sounds like it was
Hmm.
giving you the same catharsis as writing how the distortion felt and affected you, but now you're able to convey that visually. So
Yeah,
that's really fascinating.
yeah,
And I think that's kind of one of those interesting things, because like you can't, like your experience can't really be conveyed to another person except through like metaphor. And
right.
like that's kind of just part of art in general, is being able uh to create those feelings in others that can create kind of that shared experience.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was really like a visual mediation of
Mhm.
that experience.
Yeah. And then that kind of does break down to like uh what is art in that case, like uh and that's kind of like a weird side story that I don't know if I have the mental fortitude to go down.
Well, I wonder, when you're using these
Hmm.
technologies that, um, for, I guess it depends on the artist and it depends on how you use the
Hmm.
technologies to create your art. But there is a specific skill set you develop when dealing with AI art, and it's around engineering your prompts, right?
Hmm.
Because you can't just put anything in, and you have to experiment, and you have to do so many iterations and so many
Hmm.
little tweaks to the prompts that you're giving the AI generator to come up with something that meets what
Hmm.
you were looking for in the first place. Even when I do these visual writing prompts, this is just purely for fun, right? I
Hmm.
just want to put a prompt out every week and get other writers, give them something to write about essentially, right? And I do it on Mondays because who wants to start their week, right? It's like, so let's so I put these out on Mondays so you can think about something other than work for the week.
Hmm.
But even like those prompts, those visual writing prompts, like I go through hundreds of iterations of my textual prompts before I get an image that I want to post for that. Yeah,
Hmm.
my iPad and phone and my laptop are literally littered with
Hmm.
thousands of these different like images generated by these prompts just for me to get one that I'm going to post that week.
Yeah,
And
and
it's
I
kind of the
think.
same process when I was
Mhm. No, go on.
I was it was kind of the same process when I was doing Scarlet, and that is
Hmm.
when I would take the glitched images of like the still lives of like things in the house. I would still do like at least a couple hundred for each one that I finally settled on, right? It wasn't just a one and done kind of thing.
Right.
Hmm.
I'm sorry, Will, you were going to say?
And oh, I was gonna say like that iteration is kind of the one of the interesting parts when you're going through like mid journey or stable diffusion,
Hmm.
when you're like, even just the order that you're putting in words for the prompt just changes how
Right.
it's responding to like the importance of specific words, or using one word over over another. And I wonder if like do you find that that kind of ties into your a certain type of poetry as well? Uh, like how it processes language into a visual image?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know like specifically, but I have noticed that um, when I initially craft my prompt, given that my background is in poetry, um,
Mhm,
I will do my initial prompt in a way that sometimes is too poetic for the engine,
mhm,
and it has trouble interpreting it, right? It doesn't like interpret like the different elements of the image in the order I would like them to. And so what I
mhm,
find myself doing is breaking the way I would usually write, and the order in which I would include details in the request in order to get closer to an image that I'm looking for.
Yep.
So it's almost like a reverse process. It's like my
hmm.
poetry self kind of gets in the way and I have to like intervene and break that up.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So, have you found like uh, has that caught led you to like deconstructing your writing process at all? Just out of curiosity.
So far it hasn't. And I wonder if it's because I've moved into much more of a fiction writing mode right now.
Mhm,
Even though I am doing Flash and I am doing shorter forms that require that economy of language and that distillation, um, because I'm writing genre fiction, I am not as experimental as I am in my poetry. So in my poetry, I would
mhm,
take that kind of disruption in like expected grammar and language use, and I would just run with that, right? Because as an experimental poet, that's part of my practice. But
right.
in genre fiction, I am um, trying to be how do I put this? Well, just not as experimental as I am with my poetry, right? In my poetry,
Mhm,
it's like I want you to come to my poetry and bring your own experience and background to it, your own understandings. I don't want to
mhm,
tell you what you should be thinking when you're done reading the poem. I want you to kind of take from it what you will and have that shaped by
mhm,
your own experience and interpretation, right? And my experimental writing and poetry allows me to do that. With genre fiction, and I primarily write like, well, I'm leaning much more towards dark fantasy and horror lately. But in my genre
Nice.
fiction, like I'm trying to not lose my reader, right? I want to give them a
mhm.
sense of the world, and that's so important. It's so important in a flash piece, right? It's like you need to
Sure.
accomplish so much in such a short space of time. Um, that still needs to be a story, and so I really need to be able to orient them in the world. I need them to be able to follow a character and how they change and their wants and their failures. And then I need it to end in a way that ties back to the beginning. And so that's satisfying, right?
Mhm,
And so because of that, I've tended to not be as experimental as I would be in my poetry. It might just be how I currently am right now. Maybe in the future I might start breaking
mhm.
my own rules for that. But
And I think like there is that with poetry, it's much more expressive. It's more like a painting as compared to
mm,
like the narrative of like an illustration or a comic book.
right.
Right.
And so like I could definitely see the different thought process there from like what I do. But yeah, I do just I'm curious to see like how that like machine learning systems like that, and even with things like Chat GPT, how that will like impact writers going forward, since it requires a different skill set of writing to really get the most out of these machine learning, what we call AI programs. Um, and I'm very just kind of fascinated to see like how that, like what the impact on the future of writing is going to be from there, because we're dealing with a brand new tool that I guess I mean, I'm just kind of fathering on, because like, who can predict what the future is going to hold with any of this?
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, so in like genre fiction, so like, sci-fi,
Hmm.
fantasy, and horror, journals are taking different stances on the use of AI. Most of them
Hmm.
have added explicit statements to their submission guidelines saying that they will not accept any. It doesn't even have to be wholly AI generated text. It can't even be like influenced by, right? Like you can't like outline a short story
Oh,
using AI and then write it. And then there are some journals like Metastellar who
Hmm.
actually has an AI policy, and they actually will accept work that is AI assisted. I'm trying to remember. I don't think they will accept work that is wholly AI generated, but they do have a policy acknowledging that these tools are not going away. And so we are starting a policy
Hmm.
for how the types of uses that we will accept. And they're more in an assistive capacity, so
Hmm.
like either outlining or like prompt generation or something like that. That's like the first one I've seen recently to actually adopt one that accepts it. There's another press, I'm totally blanking on the name, that put out a specific call for entire AI generated stories. Like they wanted, and they were like a grim dark kind of fantasy
Hmm.
journal, and they specifically wanted, but as part of it, they also wanted a record of your prompts. So they
Hmm.
wanted
so
your prompt
they could see
along
the whole
with
process.
exactly, yeah,
Okay.
which I thought was
Interesting.
interesting too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Hmm.
it kind of makes sense though, because like as a writer, my initial thing, because I don't really use AI to help me with anything. So my initial primal, lizard brain goes, well, you don't do it like I do it, so that's wrong. But then I think about like, okay, like if I watch a movie and part of it inspires me and I go outline a story where that's the start of my thought process, that could totally be my story because I'm not ripping it off, but that was the origin point. So if someone's origin point starts out with AI prompts, what's the issue with that? That's kind of my thought process on it.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, as a, I I take such pleasure in what I write that I don't use AI for my writing, because that's like my joy. And so I
Hmm.
love kind of just like diving into it and living in the worlds I'm
Right.
creating. If it's poetry, I'm really enjoying like, the language that I find myself immersed in as I'm doing these found language pieces. So I don't know if I would use AI to assist in writing. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll see where that goes. For
Hmm.
right now, I enjoy what I'm writing too much
I
to let
totally
that
get that. And
be part of it.
Hmm.
Francesco, I got to say, so unfortunately, I have to go soon. I can just tell that
Oh,
we could
that's
talk to you
fine.
for hours because you are awesome. I hope we have you on the
Exactly.
podcast again. This has been so fun, but I
I'd
wanted
love
to
to come
kind of,
back. Thanks for having me.
yeah, this is delightful. And I'll see you on Mastodon now, and I'm going to be more active on Blue Sky. That's really exciting that there's burgeoning communities. But I wanted to leave us with one final question. So, as we've been talking, you've been talking about Scarlet, which is your collection of erasure poetry about the pandemic, and your other works. Like, where can our listeners find your works? Do you have a website that we can put in the description, or are you on Amazon? Like, because I know people are going to want to hear this and want to explore your poetry more, and so I'd love to
Oh,
direct them
thank you.
towards that. Yeah.
So you can find my books on like online resellers or at the publishers themselves. So Amazon definitely has like all the publishers that publish my work have them available on Amazon. So that's like a one-stop shop to get them. Just
Cool.
search for my name, and you'll see all the ones that are available there. My own website is francescolevato.com. And I update it as often as I can, not as often as I like, but that contains links to a lot of the current published work. So, like, you can see samples of Scarlet from the various online journals that have published it. You also can find a not as updated as I would like post on all the speculative fiction that I've had published recently and is
Hmm.
available in journals. That kind of depends, because a lot of like genre publications, they're not available online. You have to like actually buy a
Mhm.
PDF or a print version.
Right.
But there are some that actually have like access to my speculative fiction, just on their website, and you can find links on my own website with that. And then I'm on Mastodon and Blue Sky. If you find me on the site that formerly is called Twitter, it will just be a masthead that says I've moved. So, and I've deleted everything else in the account aside from a post on how to find me on the different platforms.
Mhm.
So,
I should have done
oh,
that instead of just deleting
Instagram
my
too.
account. That was smart. I should have done that instead of just outright deleting my account.
Well, I didn't want to like. I had read at the time that I left that if you completely delete your account, then somebody else could re-register as that, and
Mhm.
essentially kind of like have a spoof account with your name. And so I'm like, you know what, I'm going to park it, and I'll just have not at this address is what I posted for my
Smart.
header.
Very smart.
So
Yeah. And then it's kind of like if things do change wildly and you want to go back, you can pick it back up at a later time
That's smart. I should
without
see if I
having
yeah,
still have. I think I have 60 days to reactivate, so I might follow your.
yeah.
That's a good
Just keep your
protocol.
name.
So yeah,
It's
no,
always
that's smart.
good
yeah, and
to have your own
that's a
name on the internet.
Indeed.
yeah, that's a bit more optimistic, Will, than I am right now about it, but
I'm no, I'm well aware of the trash fire that is falling to earth at a remarkable speed.
yeah.
I've actually been rather entertained by the cacophony of poor decisions that seem to be uh, almost intentionally being made.
Right,
Um,
yeah.
and so like there's still a chance as the more it comes down in value, like maybe maybe it'll come down that some millionaire will buy it and try to do something else.
Because the value will have fallen so much that you won't need billions to buy it anymore.
You
So,
never know. Well,
yeah.
Francesco, thank you so much for coming on. This has been delightful. Again, all of our listeners, Francesco Levato, go find his stuff. Bits of Scarlet that I was able to read before this interview were really poignant, and so I can't wait to sit down and digest the whole thing, especially now that I know your fascinating process behind it. And we got to talk more because there's so much cool stuff to talk about. You've got me fired up about diving into my own writing, and like, oh, this has been awesome, man. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, yeah, it's been great. Thanks for having me, guys.
Of course. Well, thank you everyone for watching Nerds and Friends.